All right, so welcome everybody to our evening lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce Anne Bailey, who is a senior analyst with Kuppinger-Cole Analysts. She researches and provides insights on digital identity and its intersection with cybersecurity and emerging technology, such as machine learning and blockchain. Her experience providing research to corporate decision makers is influenced by her work with nonprofit organizations in Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the US. Her other research areas include public value, innovation, diversity, and competitiveness. She holds a BA from Pacific Lutheran University, a master's certificate from Johns Hopkins Nanjing University, and an MA in International Business Management from Lauder Business School. In today's lecture, she introduces the topic of identity and access management as a key enabler of cybersecurity and enterprise operations, and discusses the emerging relevant topics in 2022, digitization, verification, decentralization, and reusability. And I'll hand over to today's lecturer. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm glad that you found time to be here today. We have a lot to cover in 45 minutes. I wrote this description thinking that we would be speaking for a little bit longer, but that means that we'll get through it quickly and it will be very dense. So let me share my screen and we can get started. So as the introduction alluded to, we're going to eventually get to the future of identity. And we're looking at this in the context of an organization, of a business that needs to manage both the security of its IT space, but also be looking for growing its business to meet its mandate of existence of continuing to find customers, make profit. And so the question of how identity fits in here, we need to start with the foundation, where we came from, before we can get to the future. So that's roughly what we will do here. We'll start out with defining identity and access management. Maybe this is familiar to you already. Maybe this is a totally new topic, but I'll take you through. And then there are a few different lenses we can look at. Thinking about identity as a security measure, as a security barrier for the organization is really the traditional view. But the more we move into a digital environment, we should be thinking about identity as an enabler for the business. And that leads us very much to the future of identity and which trends are really impacting the development of the space. So feel free, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Or you can unmute yourself and ask them during the session. Since we're a small group, we can also turn this into a discussion. So if we kick off with defining IAM, this is standing for Identity and Access Management, but that's putting together two different ideas. You have the identity portion, but you also have the access management portion. So we'll start with thinking about identity being not all that different than the way we think about ourselves and our own identity. So if we take myself as an example, I have a name, I have an age, I have a birthplace, I have a passport number, I have a tax ID number. I have all of these attributes that are not me, but they describe me. And so that's also very similar to how we think about identity in the IT space, where an identity needs to connect to an identifier, but that identifier can have many, many different attributes. Now, if we move over to the access management and identity and access management portion of this, we can use this to think about the IT space and the IT environment. So each entity, each moving part in the IT space, that could be a person, that could be a process, that could be a thing or a device, is going to be accessing different resources. Those could be digital resources. Those could be physical resources like gaining access through a door or access to a manufacturing site. So those resources have quite a wide definition here. So managing all of those identities and the sorts of resources that those identities can have access to is really the focus of this concept. So there's all sorts of vocabulary that we could take with us. If we had a little more time, I would take you through each of these in more detail. But some of the really important pieces here are provisioning and deprovisioning. So you can see that that's the center top tile here. And that's a process that happens when an individual joins the organization. So that's the process of getting them initially into the directory system, getting them access to the right resources. You can think of anybody as joining the organization. Now, when that person is moved to a different department, or maybe even leaves the organization altogether, there needs to be that deprovisioning section as well, where that identity no longer has access to those resources, or maybe that access changes. If they were promoted, maybe they get more access to different resources. So that's very critical to the function of identity and access management in an organization. There are also different aspects like authentication. This is probably something that you guys are all familiar with. This is anytime you log in to an account somewhere, that process is going through, or that process is authentication. The resource, the app, the service, whatever it is you're accessing, is determining, are you actually the person that we think you are? Do you have the right credentials to access? With the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead and we can talk about some of these core functions as well, again, very briefly, just to give you an overview how critical this is to an organization. Identity and access management is usually very tightly knit with the directory service. This is the mechanism to manage the identities, the attributes, the access entitlements within that IT environment, and then managing all throughout the life cycle. So you may be defining business roles and linking them to those identities. You may be modifying or, monitoring access for any suspicious behavior. So there's also aspects of governance here, ensuring that only data that is necessary and relevant is shared. So these are some of the core functions. The next slide is a shock and awe slide, but it's to give you the idea that identity flows everywhere in the organization. So I'll take you through very briefly. Look over on the left side of this slide. You're going to see a list of things like consumers, customers, partners, workforce, services, things, devices. All of these things in the organization end up needing identities, and those identities need to be managed. And now if we flow all the way to the right side, there's another list: digital services, applications, platforms, infrastructure, backend services, legacy IT. All of these things need to consume identities. It's likely that none of these were built by the same vendor or provided by the same vendor. They maybe have different requirements, different infrastructure altogether, may be located only on premise, may be located only on the cloud. So that's a big challenge that organizations face today, is how to get all of these different identities connected with all of these different services and locations. And that's what all of the jumble in the middle is how we get there and how we keep connecting them. But we can talk about that some other time. So that was our introduction to identity and access management. And now let's take the traditional view. Identity is security. If you think of any physical building, and a castle is a great example. A castle was a defensive structure with walls, and you wanted to know who came in and who came out. If we bring that now to the 21st century, or maybe the 20th century, that would be better for our digital shift. For in the 20th century, and you have a great big company, maybe they have manufacturing functions on site, maybe they have really critical intellectual property there, who knows? But at the door, they need to know who you are. There's a fence around the property, there's security guards. All of that is to understand who comes in and out. So that's the traditional view of identity. It is security. And that remains largely true when we shift from the physical environment, where we're checking physical perimeters, and move to the digital environment. But it becomes much more complicated. We lose the physical perimeter because all of a sudden every individual device is a new hole in the fence. And there are many other aspects to that, not just the different types of devices. So the main goals behind using identity as a security measure is to know who somebody is, to know what they're trying to do, and to know what they're trying to access. And of course, you can break this down into more specific goals, like ensuring that only an authorized person or thing has access to whatever resource they need. Another aspect is making sure that all the access activity is monitored to make sure that there's no abnormal behavior. And that could be from internal people, from an employee, for example. If they're accessing a resource at a really weird hour, not during work hours, from a really strange unknown device, that could be a security hazard. You also want to be making sure that you're issuing the correct credentials to the right person. So that's an element of identity verification. And taking that a step further, you want to make sure that the same person that you issued those credentials to is the same person using them, that those credentials haven't been stolen and are being used by a bad actor. And another interesting one is governing and making sure that any single person doesn't have too much access. We call that privileged access management. So that if there is somebody with a lot of power in the organization, they tend to have access to every single resource at any time. There's no stop gates for them. That's a huge security risk, because as soon as that person's credentials become compromised, the bad actor all of a sudden has the same access that that privileged person does. So this is really the looking at identity as a security measure, and we can go deep into all sorts of different corners of security. One of those is fraud reduction, where there's a very close connection between identity proofing or identity verification and reducing fraud, particularly in things like account takeover fraud. That's where you have a person with a valid account. I have a bank account at XYZ Bank, but somebody gets my credentials and uses my bank account on without my knowledge, opens a mortgage, takes out a loan, something like that. That's account takeover fraud. So ways that you can counter that are things like risk-based multi-factor authentication. Remember, authentication is when you log in to a service, when I log into my bank, my online banking. When we move that to multi-factor, that means it's not just a username and password. It's using, for example, a password and biometrics, or biometrics and a one-time passcode. There are more than one factors which are being asked of me to prove that I am me. So that helps reduce that. Also being able to evaluate what sort of credential or device intelligence we have. Is it a known device? Is it coming from a known IP address? Many different aspects could come in here. Another sort of fraud, which is really tightly, or is best, maybe not best, but is able to be mitigated with identity, is new account fraud or account opening fraud. And that's where I, Annie, do not have an account with this bank, but somebody steals my credentials and opens one in my name. Or they could use synthetic credentials. They could make something up, essentially, which looks like a real person and open a new account. And the way to counter this is using this identity verification aspect of increasing the identity assurance level, increasing the level of confidence that you have that the person is who they say they are. And so by using identity verification steps, you can help reduce this sort of fraud. So again, that's just one example of many on how we can use identity as a security tool. But it's not just a security tool, because unfortunately, security has not necessarily a bad name in business, but it's a cost center. It's not something which is generating revenue, and anything which is not generating revenue, business folks tend to want to minimize. And so it's important to change the narrative a little bit and also see identity as an enabler for business. And the more we move into the digital world, the more this is really true. And so what could identity enable? What are we moving towards? And so if we look first at this picture, of course, it's very, very future friendly. We have automation, we have great manufacturing, we have somebody there, only one person in the room to manage all of these different machinery. But there are many things in this room which could have an identity. And if they don't communicate well with each other, it becomes really difficult to get anything done. But when they communicate well with each other, then you can move very quickly to higher performance. So again, our goal of identity and access management is to enable anybody and connect them with anything, anywhere. So we want any type of person, be it an employee, be it a contractor, be it a supplier, be it a customer, be it a device, be it a process, have that identity be able to connect and communicate with online services, with legacy applications that were home built, and be able to do that regardless of location, in the cloud, or actually on the premises of this manufacturing plant. So that's the vision. But what are some examples? So I mentioned these different groups of people that could have different sorts of identities. You can have the internal workforce, your employees, who have an employee ID. They have access to their email, to different applications to do their daily work. And so the goal here to enable business is to enable those employees to do their jobs better, faster, to reduce time constraints. Whereas adding security measures typically adds time to a process. Think of going through security at the airport. You have to budget an hour of time. Employees lose a lot of time when they're constantly logging in to 5, 6, 10 different applications throughout the day if they're sitting at a computer. So enterprise single sign-on, SSO, is one option of using identity to maintain security, but also enable business or enable employees to continue doing their work without so many barriers, time barriers. If we move that over to B2B, business to business, the goal is to enable partners or contractors, freelancers, suppliers, anybody who's external from the organization, but still needs to interface with you to get things done, be able to onboard them quickly so that they can just get on with their work. If you think about a contractor who is visiting a site for 2 or 3 days, it can take a couple hours for them to be issued a physical ID card, for them to be issued all the right accesses. This can be, of course, very time consuming to the contractor who just needs to walk through the gate and get their work done. But for the organization as well, that's 2 or 3 hours that they need to pay the contractor for. It's definitely in their best interest to be able to streamline this onboarding. So examples of ways to streamline this are things like identity federation, being able to build agreements with specific identity providers from other organizations outside of your own, so that that process goes faster, that you can exchange those identity credentials, for example. Or we can talk about customers. And this has very much changed the way that customers interact with many businesses, with banks, with retailers, with your food delivery, with your streaming services. And consumer identity and access management is all about enabling self-service so that the individual can decide, hey, I'd love to order this food right now, or I'd love to stream this right now. Let them access their account, get what they need, and do it themselves. And be able to do this from any device with a lot of scalability, with support for privacy options, consent management, to understand how your data is being used, things like that. So again, we could go through the list of these examples in much more detail, but hopefully this is giving you an idea that identity in the organization can also bring higher productivity, could bring efficiencies. This is all, of course, dependent on it being implemented well, when it being put into the right processes at the right time. Just throwing tools at a solution doesn't fix anything. So when we talk about identity enabling business growth and process optimization, it of course needs to be done well. And so now we're getting to probably what you're all most interested in, which is, what is the future? Where are we going? What's happening? And there'll of course be many different opinions on this, but from my experience and what I'm seeing in my research is that there are 4 interconnected phenomenon that are building on each other and are driving digital identity development. So the first of those is privacy. The demand and rising cry for user control of our own data, of knowing who has access to it and how is it being used. And so especially the pushback against the commercialization and abuse of user information is a huge driving factor here. This was also one of the underlying factors in bringing decentralization into the picture, away from Bitcoin, more towards identity. And so looking this need for privacy is bringing forward the need for a platform independent and user controlled architecture. Along with this, reusability is something which is made possible at times, not always, through decentralization. But this is definitely a trend which is beyond decentralization. The idea that you could use an identity at more than one organization, that it could be issued by one organization, you could take it somewhere else, and it would still be considered valid. And who would control it? You would. In order to make that happen, you need to be able to store it somewhere. So the question of storage, and that often becomes synonymous with a wallet, a digital wallet, is very much in discussion at the moment, as well as the interoperability of those different wallets and the different types of credentials that they would hold. So let's dig in a little bit more. Maybe you're familiar already with decentralization, blockchain, some of these concepts. Maybe you're not. So I'm going to bring you through, again, very quickly, and bring us to decentralized identity. Blockchains, there's not one single blockchain which exists. It's not only about Bitcoin. There are many different flavors. But what these typically have in common is that there's a decentralized architecture. That means that no one organization is in charge and owns it, but rather it is autonomously running, quote unquote, where there are many independent nodes, or you can think of them as computers, who are all communicating with each other and making this independent ledger run. And that brings us to the next piece, an immutable ledger. A ledger is basically a list of transactions. And it's immutable because it's being hosted in a decentralized architecture where no one organization is in control. That means that anytime a transaction or blocks of transactions are posted to the blockchain, each of those individual participating nodes needs to agree that those transactions are correct and valid, and they don't disagree with anything which was already posted in any past transaction. And that's agreed upon with a mathematical function. And once every node has agreed upon it, it is in the blockchain and it cannot be changed, because any change that was made by a single node to a past transaction is rejected by all the others, because they look back and say, no, this doesn't make sense. And that misperforming node is rejected. Now, as we come closer to talking about identity, this immutable ledger is actually a huge problem. You can't post any private information to a blockchain because it's there forever. Nobody can change it. Everybody can see it. That's a nightmare. We definitely don't want that. But what we can use is this immutable ledger, this place of storage of transparent, this transparent place of storage for things like verifiable credentials, where you have an identity credential issued by an organization, stored with the user, but during that issuance process, a proof, essentially, sometimes called a decentralized identifier, is posted or is stored. And this doesn't contain the private information, but it contains the indicators. This information came from this organization. We can trust it. There's more to it than that, but that's the that's the short version. But what this allows is for many different organizations to be issuing credentials, for users to hold those credentials, but for another organization to check it and say, I can trust that credential because it comes from this organization at this time and place. It's valid for this amount of time for these reasons. Okay. We can look at decentralized identity in action. There's all sorts of different uses for it. We talked briefly about verifiable credentials just now, the idea that you can have a credential that's user-owned, able to be shared with any other organization that accepts it, regardless of who issued it. This moves into verified identity reuse. Here's another one of our trending topics, reusability. As we're moving from the physical world into the digital world, we want to have the same ability of opening our physical wallet and pulling out an ID card and being able to show that at many different organizations. The police accepts it, the airport accepts it, the casino accepts it to check your age. You can use the same credential in many places. That's been very hard to do with digital credentials. And so trying to achieve this goal of digital credential reuse is where decentralized identity is really shining. Can bring it into authentication, into know your customer processes, and selectively sharing attributes, so not oversharing information. If you're showing an ID card at a casino to verify your age, you're also sharing your name, perhaps an address, any other information on there. But with selective attribute sharing, you can share only that you're above a certain age, not even needing to share your birth date. So in the interest of time, we will go quite quickly through the next slides. But decentralized identity really began with privacy. As I mentioned before, this call for user control and resistance against the commercialization and abuse of private data. And so saw some of the first startups, decentralized ID startups in about 2017, much later than, of course, Bitcoin, but it took time to move away from cryptocurrencies into another function. There was some small growth, really building on the hype of GDPR. Also, Bitcoin and the blockchain was quite big at this time. And it drew a lot of attention, but it wasn't quite enough to really push it into mass adoption. The need came in 2020 when all of us went remote, and we really did need more digital ways to share information about us, but to have the confidence that it wasn't being abused, it wasn't being saved and stored somewhere that we had no control over. And so this is where a lot of proof of concepts really flourished and moved by 2021 and currently in 2022 to viable products. We're also seeing some really ambitious interoperability projects. If you're interested in identity, look at GAIN. That's the Global Assured Identity Network. Yes. They're doing some really interesting work there, not just in decentralized identity, but really infrastructure neutral. And when we move into the future, that becomes the question we ask. Will there be an infrastructure that wins out, or will we exist in a plurality? We have decentralized identities, that's what we've been talking about here, but we also have electronic IDs, what have been worked on over the last 10-ish years in Europe, in the Nordics, much longer with bank ID and with more success. You have GAIN, which I just mentioned, working to build interoperability with these many technology options. You have recently an ISO standard on the mobile driver's license and mobile documents as another non-decentralized option. So if we tie this into reuse, there's a really important aspect that we need to hold on to. The only way that you could possibly reuse a digital credential is if you can continue to trust it. If you think about going through an identity verification process, this used to traditionally only happen in person, where you would stand in front of a trained agent who knows everything about your passport or about passports, all of the security features, the holograms, any way it could be falsified. And they inspect it and they look at you and they determine that you are indeed the same person. But as soon as you walk outside of that room, that verification is totally invalid. You could lose your passport immediately and your doppelganger could pick it up and use it. There's no control or assurance that anything that happens after that identity verification actually remains to be true. And so that's what's so difficult about getting to reusable identity. But as soon as we can have a reusable identity, that means that we can start to hold our credentials. We can determine who we share it with and for what amount of time. We can put all sorts of our own access management on our own information. So the way we get there, actually, there are many, many different ways. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to go through all of them. But by binding your document information with biometric information, so doing this verification in a digital format, and being able to come back to that process, that biometric matching, perhaps during authentication, can help trigger this reuse, or being able to bring this and package this as a verifiable credential with the ability to verify that by any accepting organization. There are some different ways that we can start to get to reusability. And this will be the last thing that I cover briefly before we wrap up today. But wallets, how in the world are we going to store our reusable digital credentials? And this is where the end of this year and next year are going to be really interesting, because there's a lot happening. So if you'd like to stay up to date with this, keep an eye on what's called the EIDAS revision, or EIDAS 2.0. This is an EU regulation facilitating the use of electronic IDs. And in the revision, this will be for use in public services, in private services, cross-border in the EU. And so there's an aspect of this which is also calling for user-centric storage or a digital wallet. And there's currently a call for tenders for the citizen digital wallet. So that's a huge vote here in Europe for wallets. You also have this GAIN proof of concept, which I mentioned to you earlier, which are working to facilitate interoperability of a verified, of an assured identity to be issued in one country and accepted in another, often through the vehicle of banks, but with very flexible, a flexible vision of the future, could say. But this is also working with the entrenched habits of humanity, which is that paper is king and we love paper. And if it's real and in front of us, we can trust it. We also have the internal debates going on in the decentralized community. I mentioned verifiable credentials to you before. There's a debate between which standard do we take? Are we going to take one from the W3C or from Hyperledger anonymous credentials? Or I mentioned decentralized identifiers to you before. This is really important in making a blockchain-based or a decentralized-based identity system work, but do we need to invent something new when we have existing things like DNS or OpenID Connect has the SIOP standard out? So from all of this jumble, what we can take away is that the future may not be decentralized. We may not be using blockchain to hold all of our most precious information, but the future will likely include a user-centric digital wallet. But until we figure out what these different standards and what these different architectures are going to do, those wallets must be able to facilitate different and changing technology options, because this will continue to be in flux. So we'll skip through the rest of these and come to this conclusion. I hope you survived with me. But the future of identity, from my standpoint, it's driven by privacy, decentralization, reusability, and wallets, and the need for interoperability. We have some pretty major determining factors, like the EIDAS revision, like the adoption of the mobile driver's license. But what is really critical to the future success of this is that there's a compatible approach, because wallets will, credentials and wallets will be existing in a multi-credential, multi-wallet world, and will have to function with many different formats. So with that, I thank you so much for your attention. I had the request to submit some course feedback. This is where you can find it, unless I'm not correct, and then please correct me, Elizabeth. But that is the conclusion of this lecture. Thank you for being here late on a Tuesday afternoon. And if you have questions, you can reach out to me. My email is aba@coopercole.com. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, everybody's invited to fill out the feedback questionnaire. If it was designed for courses, but of course,
okay.
You can also do it for the lectures. Everybody is happy to, I'm sure you'll be happy to also receive some feedback. Are there any immediate questions?
I see in the chat, do I have LinkedIn? Yes, I should be at Anne Bailey with Cole.
Okay,
so you can find me there. I
will just maybe stop the recording and then leave some time for questions. So thank you everybody for joining and participating, and I wish you a nice evening. Thank you.